Good evening, Sarah. And as you're coming in, we have in the chat, if you can say which department you're from and whether you're an undergrad or a grad student, just so I kind of know, have a little bit of the lay of the land. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started because I don't want to take up a bunch of time. In the past, whenever pre-COVID, when we had these workshops, especially for the 3-minute speech, we would have a longer workshop of about an hour and a half, and we'd be in a big, and we'd have a lot of interactive activities that build your presentation. I think that the sense that I get from everyone in the era of COVID is that at 6 o'clock at night, we're all a little bit zoomed out, and people get annoyed by being asked to do too many things on Zoom. And so what my goal is today is to tell you a little bit about the 3-minute speech at the Student Research Symposium, go over what the rules are, and then give you a bunch of examples so that you come away with a really solid idea in your mind of what you're trying to do in this competition. And then I'll let you know about a couple follow-up opportunities that you'll have to talk one-on-one with people about your ideas and your presentation, and to make sure all the technology is working and things of that nature. First, a little bit about me. My name is Dr. Simpson. I'm the Dean of Arts and Sciences. I am also a communication professor in the class department. And I am actually the MC of the 3-minute speech competition. So I'm the person that and I've actually been the MC for the last 3 or 4 years. And have worked with it. I've actually worked with the Student Research Symposium from the very get-go, when it was just a germ of an idea that we were coming up with at an accreditation workshop. And so in addition to knowing about the competition, I have a lot of insider info, because actually one of my jobs as the MC is to meet with the judges after the competitions. I don't judge the competition myself, but I select the judges and I help facilitate the judging session. And so I've heard all of their back and forth behind the scenes. I know the things that tick them off. I know the things that they like. I have to tell you about those things so that these are things that work into your presentation. I also want to introduce Alejandra. Could you say hi?
Yes, I can. Hi, I'm Alejandra. I'm a graduate student with the Electrical Engineering Department, and I'm also here to help out. So if you have any questions, you can also message me directly, and I'll do my best to answer them. Good.
And Alejandra is a STEM communication fellow. She works in our writing and communication lab. And after our session, she is available if after you want to start working on things and you want to run some ideas by someone. You can get in contact with her and she can give you some feedback. She's also going to be in charge of the practice session, which we're going to have. So she's someone that you'll want to get to know. Now, let me go ahead and share my screen. And okay, give me one moment. I have a brand new computer. Oops. And there we go. There was a privacy setting that I had to undo. There we go. Can you all see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. All right. And as we go through, feel free. We'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end, but don't feel like you have to wait till the end. Feel free. You can ask me things along the way. You can put questions in the chat. Alejandra, if you can help me keep track of things that in the chat. And also, you feel free, you could just unmute and ask a question and interrupt me, and that's perfectly okay. I have my email up here. It's just like any other faculty email, steve.simpson@nmt.edu. If you have questions that you want to ask that come up after the session. So to begin, what is the 3-minute speech competition? You may or may not know that this actually isn't a New Mexico Tech specific event. This is actually an international competition. The actual international competition is called the 3-minute Thesis competition. And it developed at the University of Queensland in Australia. And actually the story behind the competition, if you see to the left of the screen, there are those little hourglass timers. And the hourglasses were used at the time Australia was going through, this part of Australia was going through a drought. And they were encouraging people to take shorter showers to help conserve water. And so they gave everyone these little hourglasses that they would put in their shower that measured out 3 minutes. And that was the suggested showering time. Well, there was a graduate dean from the University of Queensland who was looking at that one day. And of course, as with all of us, some of our best ideas come when we're in the shower. And he saw the timer. He said, you know, that actually would be a very interesting way of getting grad students to communicate their research in a very short period of time. And so that's where the germ of the idea for the 3-minute thesis came about. And if you Google 3-minute thesis, you will find any number of universities and international competitions. You go on YouTube and you can find any number of entries from the international competition. Internationally, it is a graduate student only competition. The one change that we make to it at New Mexico Tech, and this is why we call it a 3-minute speech instead of a 3-minute thesis, is that we open up the competition to undergrads as well. And I'll say from past experience that the undergrads have always given the grad students a run for their money in this competition. Don't think that you're at a disadvantage if you're not a grad student, because undergrads beat out the grad students all the time in our event. So this is open for everyone. The idea of the 3-minute speech is that this is a short, engaging presentation of your research for a non-specialist audience. It's a plain language presentation. And a little later on, I'll give you an example. We'll watch a 3-minute speech together, and we'll look at some of the components that are a part of making your presentation accessible to people outside of your field. But before we get there, let's kind of go through the nuts and bolts. Because this is part of an international competition, and actually in the past, I'll have to check and see how we're doing it this year, but in the past, the highest placing grad student in our competition went on to compete at the 3-minute thesis competition in the Western Association of Graduate Schools. So we actually are an entry point, at least for grad students, to the larger international competition. But because we're preparing you for that, we actually follow the same rules that everyone does for this competition. So this isn't New Mexico Tech rules, these are the international rules. So the idea is that for the 3-minute thesis speech, of course, it's 3 minutes long. you're only allowed one single static PowerPoint slide. So you don't have an intro slide and 5 million method slides. You don't have a references slide. You just have one slide. And you're not allowed to use any animations or transitions. You just have one slide. There can't be any sound or video either. You're not allowed to have any props in your presentation. So you can't pick up a phone and point something out, or you can't hold up a cute animal in front of the video or wear a costume. No props. You're limited to 3 minutes. And I'll show you later the timer that we're going to be using. But the idea is if you go over your 3 minutes, you're disqualified. So that is a hard deadline or hard timing. The presentations are to be spoken words, so no poems, no raps, no singing. The time starts when you start speaking. The way that this, and actually the Zoom edition is kind of new to all of us. If you look internationally, all of the international competitions last year were on Zoom as well because of the pandemic. Generally, what we let you do is when it's your turn, you come on and you get everything situated to where you're comfortable. We have your slide up, and then you get to start speaking. And that way we can make sure that you're not muted or, there's not a cat, crawling around in the background and things like that. But the idea is as soon as you start, it starts. So you can't, stop and do it over again. You have to keep going. And you're not allowed to use any notes or note cards. You're not allowed to read off of anything. It has to be completely from memory. How will you be judged? And let me actually, I'm going to pull up, I minimize that for a second because I'm going to pull up an extended rubric so that I can read some of the, this is the instructions actually that the judges have whenever they're judging your work. But generally I put together a panel of judges and I select one faculty member from arts and sciences, one faculty member from engineering, and then one staff member. And they're judging you on 3 criteria: comprehension. And by comprehension, we're asking things like, did you effectively communicate what work is being done and how for a general but educated audience? Did you explain the significance of the research? Did your presentation follow a logical sequence? So did people understand what you were saying? Engagement is the second criteria. Did you deliver a clear and concise, engaging presentation? Were you enthusiastic? Did you make the audience want to know more? Were they really interested in your topic? And then number 3 is style. Was your slide designed to clearly and effectively communicate your research to the audience? Did you make sufficient eye contact, have a confident stance, and maintain a steady speaking pace? Did you avoid jargon and explain discipline-specific terms? We'll talk a little bit later on about how we translate those things to Zoom, because understandably, Zoom is a little bit of a more awkward presentation environment than if you're presenting live. But more on that later. Those are the judging categories. Typically the day of, you'll get to meet who the judges are. Before we get going, I'll introduce them. And after you give your presentations, we'll dismiss all of you, and I'll have a separate Zoom where I'll convene with the judges, and all of them will have scored you along the way. And we start by kind of going and listing out our rankings, and then we kind of talk through the different issues. All right, so what exactly does a 3-minute speech look like? What are you aiming for? So I have and actually it probably will play better. Let me stop sharing and go straight to the YouTube. Share that directly. All right.
Imagine a crystal clear lake, the water as still as glass. You can see fish, birds, and beautiful vibrant colors. You just know that life in and around this lake thrives. Unfortunately, every day this image gets further and further away from reality. We humans have created an excess of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere that will continue to terrorize our planet. One major consequence of climate change is a decrease in rainfall and a rise in temperature. What's scary about that is it causes freshwater lakes to evaporate. And when lakes evaporate because there's too much heat and very little rain, salt concentrates and freshwater animals pay the price. So how that feels like for a freshwater animal is how you would feel running a marathon that had no breaks. The first animals affected by lake salinization are a freshwater invertebrate called water flea. But these are not the type of fleas you want to get rid of. Water fleas are at the bottom of the aquatic food chain, and many animals, such as fish, rely on them for survival. Many researchers believe that water fleas have the potential for rapid evolution because they reproduce by cloning themselves and can easily pass on a tolerant gene to their offspring in a changing environment. So this gives us some hope that freshwater ecosystems may be able to sustain themselves into the future. However, there's very little research on their actual ability to adapt to changing environments through time. I study a remote lake in North Dakota, USA, that previous researchers have found salinity has naturally gone up and down for millennia because this region is geographically prone to drought. So one way to know if the water flea will be able to tolerate salinity into the future is to see if it's tolerated in the past. What if I told you that we go back in time and see if the water flea survived during the 1930s Dust Bowl? Well, with my research, there is a way. I'm using an approach called resurrection ecology, where I hatch water flea eggs that have remained dormant in the lake sediment for centuries. I collected a meter-long core and determined that each 5-centimeter layer goes back 5 years in time. So that's 500 years worth of data. I isolated eggs from each 5-year period and resurrected them in lab to determine 2 things. The first, if they're even able to hatch in salt water, and the second, if they can hatch in salt water, what are their threshold limits? So far, what I've found is that salinity is too physiologically demanding, and water fleas will likely disappear as the climate continues to warm. Imagine a freshwater lake, as clear as crystal glass. You can see fish, birds, and beautiful vibrant colors. If we continue to take care of our planet, this will be our reality. Thank you.
All right, and she had 14 seconds to spare. So before I go and tell you what I think is significant about that, I'm kind of interested. What are some of the things that you notice about how she approached this presentation? What are some things that she did to present to a non-specialist audience? You need to have at least a little interaction. So this is a good opportunity to unmute and share some thoughts. What did she do? What did she do well? What did you think she could have done better?
She was actually very good at with her pace and calm while she was explaining. She did use words like
Yes.
a lot. So that was one of the things that I noticed that maybe that could be improved. Overall, I think that it was a good presentation. She tried to keep it simple, use simple terms. But her pace, that's what I kind of like about it. She was not being rushed. She was trying to be calm. She was nervous for sure, but she was trying to kind of control that.
Right. And that's a good point. The pace is very important. And this is probably one of the most important things in this presentation. It's important to practice all of your presentations, but this one in particular, because sometimes you can get yourself in the trouble of spending too much time explaining the initial problem. I remember there was one presenter 2 years ago who had the most wonderful, engaging opening in the world, but he spent so much time at it that he didn't have time to actually explain his research. And so, you need to think of this 3-minute speech as being discrete 1-minute chunks. What do you want to do in the first 1 minute? What do you want to do in the second? And what do you want to do in the third? And you want to practice to make sure that you're getting the information in there without speaking too fast, speaking too slow, etc. You'll also notice you mentioned that she kept things simple. She did. And here's the thing. It's not that you want to totally avoid jargon, because actually jargon is important. There's a lot of concepts where there's scientific terminology for it. And one of the things that you might want to accomplish in a presentation to the general public is making them understand a scientific term. But the idea is you don't want to use strings of them. And when you use one, you want to explain to people what it is. And at the very least, people can walk away from your presentation having learned a new idea. She did have some of the vocal tics, and we all have those, the likes and the ums. I had a public speaking professor when I was an undergraduate who insisted on the fact that you needed to get rid of all of your likes and ums in order to be a good speaker. And because we wanted to kind of show him up a little bit, and because we were, pain in the what college students, we actually would have these little tallies where we would keep track of every time he said like and in his lectures. And actually, it's very difficult to give a talk without having any of those things. They creep into all of our conversation. But again, with practice, if you practice something well enough, you can minimize that. And that really is the idea, is that you don't have to get rid of those things entirely, but you need to minimize them to the point where they're not distracting. Because when you have too many of them, not only do they take up much needed time in a 3-minute speech, but the judges will notice that. What else? Any other thoughts on her presentation? Yes, Gehan?
Yeah, Dr. Simpson, I noticed, her talk is, more of about environmental related stuff. So that is kind of a very familiar topic to, if we get a general audience also. So, but if I'm doing a presentation, if it is involving mostly kind of more theoretical explanations are needed, how, I know I'm presenting it to a general audience. It is a general in the sense, am I speaking to a, random people, or, in this SRS, how do I put it this way?
Yeah, I think I know what you're getting at.
Yeah, the judges are, I mean, I know they are, I mean, in the field of science. So, I mean, do I have to explain, I mean, the terms, or do I have to assume they have already have the background so I can go through in a kind of advanced level?
Right. So the goal of a 3-minute speech is to leave the audience with an impression, something that's very significant or important about what you're doing. And so what that means is that this isn't a very, very short research presentation. Okay. You're not presenting all of the intricate stuff about your research. You should assume that the people who are watching your presentation are educated. They're scientifically educated. I mean, you don't have to explain to them what a molecule is. You could probably assume that they know what a molecule is, but you should assume that they don't know the concepts and terminology in your field. And, you know, in designing a presentation like this, there's a selection process. You're not going to be able to tell them everything that you're doing in the thesis. And so what you need to do, and this is probably the first step in preparing your presentation, is you want to ask yourself, if my audience could walk away knowing one thing about what I do, what is that? What is the one thing that I want them to understand? And then, you know, if you can get them to remember that one thing, then that's actually something that, you know, goes a long way in getting people to, in other contexts, ask you more about your research. Actually, the structure of the 3-minute speech is also based on something you might have heard called an elevator pitch. Gahan, you should know what an elevator pitch is because we talked about it in my class. But the idea of an elevator pitch, and they always say, imagine that you're at this conference and you get into an elevator and someone turns to you and says, I'm a senator. Tell me about your research. And you only had, from the time that that person said that to when you get off the floor to tell them about what you do, what would you say? And so it's a very, very truncated form, and it's meant to focus more on the larger impact of what you do and not the particulars. And this is actually a very difficult move in science, because part of doing science and good science is to take a larger problem and to focus in on something very, very small in particular. And so your thesis is probably, you know, focused on this one little micro component. And part of doing scientific research is that you have a lot of people who are focusing on these little points. And then somewhere along the line, someone puts them together and uses them to cure cancer or something like that, right? And so you're trained as a scientist to really focus in on the particular. In this kind of talk, you want to take a step back from the very specific thing that you're doing and ask, well, why am I doing this? I mean, ultimately, what is this used for? I mean, somewhere down the road, someone is going to take this piece of knowledge that I'm working on, and they're going to use it to do something or to make something or to treat something. What is that? So try to place your project in a bigger picture. And that's what you want to try to communicate. You know, we are trying to, you know, it's very important part of medical research to find better ways of curing cancer. One of the things that we need to do is to find better mechanisms for actually delivering anti-cancer medicine. In our project, we're focusing on a very particular part of that. We're looking at a micro level how a certain type of microbubble might be able to be activated at a very precise location with ultrasound in order to deliver anti-cancer medicine to. So you see what I've done there is I've started with the bigger context, and then I've worked down to the particular problem. And then it kind of goes back out at the end where you explain, you know, at the end, she kind of gave us this nice picture of this, you know, clean lake. And that's the end goal. When we're able to do this, then we have this beautiful nature that we're protecting and we're preserving. And so you kind of come back out again to that significance. What else? Anyone else have any thoughts about what you saw? Things that she did or questions?
Dr. Simpson, I have another question.
Sure.
So it's a 3-minute presentation. So is it better to have like 2 or 3 slides or 1 slide with all the information?
You're only allowed, I think you came in a little bit late.
Yeah.
You're only allowed to have 1 slide. And it has to be a static slide. So it can't have any transitions. You're only allowed 1 slide. So actually you would be disqualified in this competition if you have more than 1 slide.
Okay, so 1 slide, I mean, no animations or nothing, just.
Right. And I actually have a couple slides further in my presentation. I actually have several examples of the slides that people used in our competition, the winners. So I have about 3 years of winner slides. And so I'll show you what people have used in the past and how they used the slides. Good. The other thing that, again, kind of getting to the structure, the one thing that she did when she began her talk is she started by describing the problem, but she also, her particular approach was to start by presenting kind of a picture. Imagine that, try to place something very concrete in the viewer's mind that will then help them understand what she's doing. This is something that we call the hook. And all good 3-minute speeches start with something early on that catches people's attention, that engages them. It could be something as simple as a very interesting question, or it could be an interesting anecdote or an interesting image of the problem that you're addressing. Actually, in the chat, I had Alejandra put a bunch of links that she had gone and searched on YouTube and found a number of examples of 3-minute theses. And I would encourage you, I mean, you can copy those and take a look at those later, but also if you go onto YouTube and you put in 3-minute thesis, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of examples. And you focus in particularly on that first minute. What do they do to grab your attention? And there's a lot of different ways of doing it. But focus in and you maybe get some ideas from different ways that people have done it. Now, I want to focus on a couple different elements of the 3-minute thesis. And the first one is important, especially if you watched the 3-minute theses or 3-minute speeches last year at the Student Research Symposium. Unfortunately, because we were closed for about 3 weeks in March last year, we weren't able to have this workshop for the 3-minute speech presenters last year. And so actually, I give the presenters last year a lot of credit because they went and put something together without really knowing a whole lot about what it was that they were attempting to do. And so I think under those conditions, they did an excellent job. But because we have the opportunity to have this, there's a couple of things I want to point out. The first one is that the title for a 3-minute thesis is not, or 3-minute speech is not going to be the same title that you're going to use in a paper on your research or in your thesis. Last year, when I was announcing the titles, actually, I had someone from the chemistry department text me and kind of poke me in the ribs a little bit because I was really tripping over those titles. They had the full academic titles. For this competition, what you're looking for is something that's short punchy, but still descriptive of the content. They still kind of have a sense of what your topic is about. The 3 lines that I have up here, these are just, I surfed randomly online and pulled out a couple example titles from 3-minute speeches elsewhere. This gives you an idea of what we're looking for, though. Sniffing out COVID-19 with a gas sensor array. Climate change, gut microbes, and you. Power ultrasound, a sound solution for a greener environment. Okay, so they're going to be punchier. And I know that you've already submitted a title as part of your application process. You do have the opportunity after this workshop, as you're working on your presentation, you can submit to the SRS a punchier title that's intended just for your 3-minute speech, okay? It might be different. You might still have a more involved title that goes on if you're presenting a poster, and that will stay the same. But you can submit something that's a little punchier just for use in the 3-minute speech. And if you want to do that, all you have to do is there's a SRS at nmt.edu email, and just mention that this is the catchy title for your 3-minute speech, and make sure that all of you have a number, application number from when you submitted your application to the SRS, and you want to make sure that that's in the subject line, just so that they connect it to the right presentation. Let's see. And yep, and Alejandra email into the chat. Now, the next thing is the slide. And Gahan, I'm glad you asked about the slide, because first of all, we have had people who showed up the day of and they hadn't paid much attention to the rules that were listed, and they came with 12 slides, and we had to tell them, sorry, that's not going to work. You know, again, part of the international rules is that there's one slide. It's static, meaning there's nothing that's moving or changing. There's no audio clips. There's no video clips. It's just one visual that can be used to supplement what you're saying. Now, the key to having a good slide is, first of all, keeping it simple, okay? You might think, wow, I only have one slide. Man, I have a lot of tables to put in. That you need to kind of start, don't start with all of the stuff that you want to cram in the slide. Start by thinking about, back to that main question, what is my main message? What is the one thing that I want people to come away knowing from my presentation? And then go to thinking about, what can I have on a slide that will help my audience understand that thing? Okay. And some problems that people have come across is, one, having things that are too complex, that you're just having too much on there, or having things that really the average person just doesn't know what to do with. Let me give you a good example of that. So several years back, we had a presentation from an astrophysics student, and he was talking about black holes. And the timing of this presentation, it was only a couple days before the 3-minute speech competition, where there was breaking news that scientists using a bunch of arrays had created the first image of a black hole. And in fact, there were New Mexico Tech affiliated telescopes that were involved in that process. And so there were some amazing images of black holes floating around that really kind of caught people's imagination. And this fella had this graph, and it was this spectral graph that had axes that he didn't even explain what the axes were. he really had to talk you through what everything was up on this graph. And even still, if you're not used to that research area and you're not familiar with that data, people had no idea what to do with that figure. And it was a huge missed opportunity. You want something that's engaging and you want it to be purposeful. There's up there that you're trying to do. It helps people visualize what you're saying. Let me give you some examples. This slide here, this is actually one of the winners from the chemistry department a couple years ago. A student named Ashani. Gahan, I think you know Ashani. Yeah. This was her slide, I believe, when she won the Student Research Symposium. And she's talking about these meta-organic frameworks. And she was, one of the things that she did in her presentation is she tried to use very everyday analogies for explaining parts of her research. And so this material that she was developing, essentially, she was arguing that it was soaking up the carbon dioxide like a sponge. And so she had this metaphor of a sponge. And so she has an image of a sponge, and then she has this other image of the MOF actually absorbing this carbon dioxide. And so that was the image that she wanted people to remember and to visualize. And so that's what she had up behind her when she was talking. She had also reminded me, I was messaging with her before this, and she reminded me that she also used an analogy of a crowded elevator to talk about greenhouse gases and global warming and kind of how that works. This was actually, I think this was the winner from the very first year that we did the SRS. And this was a mechanical engineering student. The title of the presentation was "Whole Lot of Shaking Going On." And it's been a while since I've seen the presentation, but as you can see from the right, it had something to do with the decibel levels with a rocket launch. And so she had an image of a rocket launching, and then this figure over here was something that she used in particular for explaining the different things that they were doing with their design. It's very simple. It's not a huge figure. It's just something that helps her communicate a core concept. This one, actually, all they had was a very, very fascinating image. There's not even any words associated with this. This is a geobiologist. I think she was doing a master's in biology at the time that she did this. And I think she might have come in second place, but this was her field site where she was doing her research. And as part of her talk, she was explaining a little bit more about the types of things that they would collect from this. But really, this was an interesting picture because it's so striking and it left just such a clear image. I can remember when the judges were deliberating about the presentations, they couldn't get this image out of their minds. It's something that definitely they left with. And then here's another one. This also was a biology student. This one gets the Gross Out Award. But this student was working with Dr. Thompson, and part of their research, they're looking at various chain reaction that connects artificial light to melatonin levels to breast cancer. And I can't remember exactly what she was showing with this, but I remember what the judges really liked about this. As Carly was presenting, she was referring to these different places that she had circled. And she kept kind of going back and saying, now, as you see in the middle image with the yellow circle, this is an area where, and she would kind of explain what that is and what that meant. And what the judges really liked about it is that it was a, more scientific image, but she really used it in her talk. She referred to it, and it helped them kind of visualize what it was that she was talking about. This also was a first place winner several years ago. Now, the structure of the talk. This is actually a very common structure that I'm showing you for an elevator pitch. And this comes from a book by a guy named Randy Olson, Don't Be Such a Scientist. But actually, after the workshop, go back to the sample presentation that we saw earlier with this slide in your mind. And you'll notice that her presentation fits into the structure perfectly, like Legos. Three main, he puts it in theatrical terms, and he says, think of your pitch or your speech as having three acts. Act one is the exposition. This is where you're trying to grab people's attention, and this will be 30 seconds, 1 minute at most. If you're spending more than a minute laying out the initial situation, then you're going to take too much time for the rest of your presentation. In this one, you need something that grabs their attention. You want to explain what the issue is. What effect does this have on the bigger picture? What problems are there that are causing you to want to do your research? What are you trying to solve? And then you end this section with a good statement of, well, how are you going to address it? So this is the problem. Now, in our study, how we're addressing this is, and that's where you launch into Act 2. Act 2 is where you describe how you're attempting to solve the problem. What are your methods? What's your approach? What are the complications that you experience? And how do you solve these? And then Act 3, this is the resolution. This is the climax. Therefore, what does this mean? What do we get as a result of this? We get cleaner lakes, or we get a better understanding of this particular delivery of anti-cancer drugs can improve our understanding of cancer treatment. Something that kind of relates back out to the bigger picture. So I think whenever you're planning your presentation, I had already talked about the first thing that you want to do is think about what your message is. What do you want people to know? The second thing I think you want to do is think about, okay, if that's what I'm trying to communicate and I only have 3 minutes, what do I really need to tell people in order for them to understand that? And I would actually start by thinking in terms of these 3 basic parts. The exposition, where you explain the problem, the rising action, where you explain how you're addressing the problem, and then the resolution, what that means. And start with a couple bullets under each of those sections where you kind of sketch out some main ideas, so that you're starting with the basic structure. And then you can think a little bit more about, well, how can I deliver these pieces of information in an engaging way? That's much better than starting with a 10-minute talk and trying to cut 7 minutes to get it down to size, which is kind of what I see a lot of people trying to do in a 3-minute speech. Now, here are a couple of the pet peeves. I mentioned that, I've spent a lot of time, I get to hear all of the judges and what they say, and some of the things that really kind of, get their goat. And these are some of the things that have come up. First of all, in a 3-minute speech, it might be that you, if you're a funny person, you might have a humorous opening to your presentation. I think the best advice that I can give someone is that if you're not by nature a funny person, don't feel like you need to put a joke in your presentation. You want to be true to yourself. If you're a pretty serious person, you can be serious and engaging. If you are one of those people who can pull off a good joke, you can give it a try, but again, keep it moderate. This is a talk on your research and not a comedy routine. But the big thing is you want to be wary of inappropriate humor. It did happen 3 or 4 years ago that we actually had 2 presenters who the judges disqualified because they both had sexist humor in their presentations. And it wasn't even super over the top. It was just in poor taste. And it was something that the judges thought just, it didn't belong. And so you want to think about that. You want to think about your audience. Another thing is that there are people who have had things up on the slide behind them, and they never once told people what it was or referred to it in any way. You want to actually use the slide and refer to the slide in your talk. And actually, this is one of those things in the past when the judges have been deliberating, and let's say the top 2 are really clear, but there's like a number 3 and a number 4 are really close to each other, and they're debating about, okay, well, which one makes the top 3? A lot of times they'll go back to the slide. Did they have something that was really engaging and useful, and did they use it in their talk? And in one case, it came down to one person who really didn't use their slide at all, and one person who did, and that the person who did was the one who ended up with the 3rd place. If it's too jargony, that will turn them off. Again, you can use jargon, but make sure that you explain it. So in this study, we're going to be talking about the topic of X, which means, and then all you have to do is add that little phrase that explains what that piece of jargon is. And then not only have you used the jargon, but you've taught your audience what it is. They've walked away learning something. The speed, and this gets back to, I think it was Sarah who mentioned the pacing of the talk that we looked at, how she paced herself through it. You don't want to go too fast. If you find that you're really racing to get your talk in 3 minutes, then maybe you should go and cut a few things out. Okay. You also don't want to go too slow. You also, you don't want to go over 3 minutes, but you also don't want to finish way too early. So there have been some people who they gave their talk in 2 minutes. And when the judges were deliberating at the end, and again, they were comparing a couple different strong presentations, and they looked at one and said, you know, they had a whole other minute that they could have done something with, and they didn't. And that's something that worked against them. So the sample presentation that we watched, she had 12 seconds remaining. And that's a good thing to work for. You don't have to go right up to the 3 minute mark, but you also don't want to leave too much time. And then by accuracy, we've had some people who, I think one person, I'm trying to remember what date it was. It had something to do with the Kennedy presidency, and he had the wrong dates. And one of the judges actually wrote that down in her notes. And in her mind, that was, 3 strikes against him, because that's something that he could have even Googled, and, he would have gotten it right. Some tips: watch sample 3-minute theses. This is a very specific genre, and it helps when you look at examples of other people who have done it. Again, if you look in the chat, Alejandra has placed several different examples. I'll actually repaste these for the benefit of, oops. Well, here, Alejandra, can you go ahead and paste them again? Because Gahan actually might not, you might have come in too late for that. Practice. Practice several times. You should be at the point where someone could wake you up at 1 in the morning and out of a dead sleep, and you could stand up and do your 3-minute speech. And then Alejandra is available. Again, she works with our writing and communication lab. I put down the main email for the writing lab, but she might have other ways that you can get in contact with her as well. And she is available to give you some tips on your slide if you want to, help her or have some help practicing. It also is kind of good to practice with Zoom, because again, Zoom is somewhat of a awkward presenting method. Some Zoom etiquette. First of all, you do have to have a camera for this competition. You do actually have to be visible on video, because part of what we're looking at is your mannerisms while you're presenting. If you don't have access to a camera or a good camera, send me an email, because there are actually places on campus right now where you can take out some webcams, and we can make sure that you have a way to do that. But I encourage you to test out your camera and microphone beforehand, make sure they're good. I would encourage you to find a good solid colored background to stand in front of. There are the virtual backgrounds that you can put up, but the problem with them is that, generally when you put your head back, you start to get swallowed up by the background. And I think in a presentation like this, that could get a little distracting to the audience members. And so I would encourage you to not have anything. Now, Zoom does have the option where you can blur your background. That might be a good idea. Or just find a good wall, a good bright wall. Make sure that you stow away pets so that you don't have this kitty cat crawl into view. Roommates, zombies, if you have any, don't let them wander out. Minimize unexpected noises. I had students giving presentations for one of my classes, and her roommate decided to start vacuuming right in the middle of her presentation. So make sure people know not to vacuum. Find a secure internet connection. Some of you know already that your connection at home is bad. And if that's the case, we could probably help you find places on campus that might have a more stable connection. Dress for success completely. And, of course, there's the joke about people wearing a suit and tie from waist up and shorts on the bottom. But, I would dress like you were going to walk into a job interview physically. So, make yourself look good. Practice looking into the camera. It's kind of more difficult on Zoom to make eye contact. And I'm even kind of doing it here because I have a very big monitor. And on my monitor, all of you are over here, but the camera's over here. And so if you want a really good presentation where it looks like you're actually talking to your audience, you want to actually be looking at the camera. And so I would practice that with whatever device you're going to use, actually looking at, and even, with your Zoom accounts, you can record yourself and then play it back, and you can see what you look like on the camera. And so that's a good thing to do. And then you do want to know of your hand gestures, especially on Zoom. Sometimes the camera will cut your hands off just at the place where you end up with a couple disembodied thumbs floating around. So gestures can be very useful, but try to be purposeful with them. So in other words, you can use them when you're trying to give a size, or you're trying to communicate an action, but you try to minimize just the random Woody Allen hands that aren't really communicating a whole lot of anything. And then lastly, a couple procedures, and then I'll open things up to questions. Again, you can make a version of your title that's a little catchier, and you can send it to the SRS website. I would do that before Friday, April 9th, so they can make sure to have that in their program. And again, you can tell them this is just for 3-minute speech, so that you can have, a slightly more complex title for your poster if you're doing a poster, but you want something catchy for this one. Your slide, your static slide, has to also be sent to the SRS by Friday, April 9th, 5 p.m. They actually will be putting your entry number down. I think the entries down at the bottom, and then we put a little timer in there. So there's actually this little video of a timer, of a 3-minute timer, that you'll see whenever you're presenting. There are rehearsals, and there's a sign up here. And if you go onto the SRS website, you'll see the link for how to sign up for the Alejandra, would you be able to put in the URL for the SRS at New Mexico Tech in the chat? But this gives you an opportunity to try out your 3-minute speech and get a little bit of feedback from someone. There also is a technology test. In other words, if you want to test out your technology and make sure your camera's working, your microphone's working, they will be giving more information about this on the SRS website, but so the event itself is on April 15th, and on April 12th and April 13th, from 1 to 5 on the 12th, and then 8 to 5 on the 13th, you'll be able to kind of do a drop-in with some representative from the Student Research Symposium, and you can make sure that everything is good with your microphone, with your camera, etc. And then just a little bit about the actual event. We collect your slides, and we have someone who is managing on our end, who's managing Ecology. And so we share your slide. You don't have to do that. And then we give the audience tips on how to set their viewing so that they end up seeing your slide with your video right next to it speaking. And so that's how things will look to the audience. But we'll actually be the one who shares your slide. And so that's why you want to make sure that you send it to us. Also, just the tip, in the past, it's been good idea to share, send both a PowerPoint version, and it's not a bad idea to also have a PDF version of that, in case something if they open up your PowerPoint and something looks really weird, and they look at the PDF and they can see, oh, it's not supposed to look like that. That just kind of helps let them know that that's an issue. All right. Well, with that said, are there any questions? Gahan, is that a hand raised from before, or is that a new hand?
Yeah. Is it okay to use, I mean, pointers and kind of stuff?
To use
The pointers in present PowerPoint? Those kind of stuff?
you will not be, well, you won't have your slide. We'll be presenting your slide. So you won't even be able to use a pointer now.
Okay.
So the advice I give people then is to point with your voice. So in other words, and I remember this is one thing that Carly did in this one. She would say in the middle image, in the area circled in yellow. And so what she's just done is the same thing that you would do with a laser pointer, only with her voice. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute if you have a question. Good. All right. All right. Well, if no one has any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and call this to a close so we can all go and have a good night. But again, don't feel like, you know, if something comes up, if something does come up, you can send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions. Alejandra is available to give you some tips on slides, on your presentations. And again, we do have an opportunity for you to practice. You do have to RSVP and sign up for the practice. And there is an opportunity for you to test out your technology as well. Again, and Gahan, it might be a good idea after you get this video should be posted on the website. I would go back to the beginning because I went over some of the rules. And in fact, those should also be on the SRS website because again, we're going by the international rules. And so there are things, you know, if you pull up a prop, it's, you know, it's going to be a disqualification. So you want to know what those are. All righty. Well, I wish you all the best and I'll see you all later. Have a good evening. See you later.